Hey guys, it's Hailey and welcome to another bookish video. Today I'm going to be sharing with you some of my most favorite books that have wonderful mental health representation. I am doing this in honor of May being Mental Health Awareness Month. Obviously, if you've been around my channel for a while, you know that I am a therapist myself. I just started my own private practice, so this is what I do every single day in and day out is therapy and mental health counseling. So this topic is very important to me personally, professionally, and literaturely. I don't know. I do think mental health representation is exceedingly important in fiction though. So I have a lot of book recommendations to share with you. But before we get into those, I have a very apt sponsor for this video. Thank you so much to BetterHelp for kindly sponsoring this book recommendation video. If you guys have never heard of BetterHelp before, let me tell you a little bit about it. It is an online counseling service. So obviously one of the biggest gripes that I have being in my own field is that access to mental health care can be really, really hard to come by, and BetterHelp is working to combat that problem by making mental health care way more accessible and affordable and easy. I know starting therapy can seem like a very intimidating undertaking, but BetterHelp really does make it so easy. You can go online and choose exactly the type of therapist that you want, so you're not just going in blind. You know that the person that you get matched with is going to have everything that you chose, and if you ever want another match, you can always get that. And they offer tons of different types of therapy for individuals, for couples, for teens, and there's all different types of therapy, virtual wise too. You can do a phone call, a video call, which is what I do with some of my clients. I see them through a video platform and it's really wonderful. I think it's just as effective as in-person therapy. During COVID, I was really scared to transition into that with my clients, but it actually worked out really well. So don't be afraid to try online therapy. They also do offer texting sessions as well, if it's even too anxiety inducing to be face-to-face or over the phone with your therapist. And for my audience today, BetterHelp is offering you guys 10% off. So I will have my link down below. If you've been thinking about starting therapy and you're not quite sure where to start, you're looking for something easy, accessible, approachable, affordable, definitely click my link and look into BetterHelp. There's no better time than right now to address the things that you might have knocking on the door. We can just open it up a crack. That's what I tell my clients all the time, is we don't have to swing open the door and let everything in, but just clicking the link and maybe getting a match that might help you could open the door up a crack and kind of let those things in that need to be addressed. So please check that out, and thank you so much for BetterHelp for sponsoring. Again, I could not think of a more perfect partnership for this video. So before we get into the book recommendations, I do want to let you guys know that I was recently on Gwen's podcast, Talk Bookish to Me, and I gave her a ton of these recommendations. We had a wonderful conversation about representation, what makes good representation, why representation is so important, and why, bad representation is so harmful. I really enjoyed having that conversation with her and, giving my professional perspective to her audience. So I will also be linking that episode that I was on of her podcast down below, so you guys can listen to it if you want a little bit more information or just to hear a more in-depth perspective on what I think about mental health in literature. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the book racks. I'm gonna start with thrillers, obviously. That is my favorite genre. That is probably why you're here. So I recently did a reading vlog reading a bunch of Lucinda Berry's thrillers, and she was actually a child psychologist and child trauma researcher, so I was expecting big things. I had very high hopes, and she definitely did not disappoint. I think if you're looking for a thriller that tackles mental health in a sensitive and accurate way, you should definitely try out her books. She never uses mental health as a twist or stigmatizes any type of diagnosis. She actually does the opposite, where she helps the audience gain empathy for those who are struggling with a certain psychological disorder. My favorites of her backlist, although I would recommend all of them, my favorites are Saving Noah, which follows a 17-year-old who struggles with pedophilic disorder. Could be triggering to some, but if you think you can handle it, it's an absolutely phenomenal read. I would also recommend The Perfect Child. This follows a couple who struggled with infertility. They decide to adopt this girl who comes with a lot of baggage, a lot of trauma, and she kind of turns their world upside down. The therapy rep in both of these books and all of Lucinda Berry's books is so wonderful, and it's really great to see accurate, positive representation within the thriller genre. This next one is a little bit more of a mystery, but I really enjoyed it nonetheless. We have The Color of B. Larkham's Murder by Sarah J. Harris. I read this one a few years ago, but I remember really enjoying it and really loving being inside our main character's head. So this book follows a young boy with autism spectrum disorder. I don't believe it's referred to ASD, which is the proper diagnosis today, because this was written quite a few years ago. It may refer to it as Asperger's, which is outdated as of now, so just keep that in mind. But any kind of neurodivergent representation I think is great, especially when we see it in a kid. And this kid witnesses the murder of his neighbor out his window, but because of his neurodivergence, it's really hard to explain to his dad what happened, what he saw, because he sees things in colors. That is the best way that he can communicate. And I've actually seen this with quite a few of my neurodivergent clients, not specifically with colors, but where their brains code things differently. So not necessarily into words, but maybe into images or maybe into symbols. And I thought that type of ND rep was just really cool to see. And it's also a really fun murder mystery story. Next up, I would recommend Anxious People by Frederick Bachman. Obviously, this book has anxiety rep. It says it right in the title. And this follows a group of people who are at an apartment viewing. They're seeing if they want to move into this apartment. Meanwhile, across the street, a bank is being robbed. The robber panics when he sees the cops outside, runs into the apartment building, and now suddenly all of these apartment viewers are being held hostage by this robber at gunpoint. And that does sound like a very scary thriller-ish plot, but this is much more like a quirky contemporary story where all of these characters get to know each other and gain empathy for each other. There is great representation in here for anxiety, for trauma, for grief, for suicidality, anything like that. It is a bit of a heavy read, but I absolutely love Frederick Bachman's writing style, and I think it's just so well done with all of the mental health rep. It really helps you gain empathy for the characters as you're reading. Next up, I would recommend Brunch and Other Obligations by Suzanne Nugent. And this follows this friend group who was brought together because they all have a mutual friend who passed away. And her dying wish for these three women, her best friends, is that they continue to meet and get brunch every week. And these three women don't really care for each other, but they are all brought together with the grief of their friend. And I have never read a book that captures grief in such a real, visceral way. I actually started out my career in counseling with grief counseling, so this book is really close to my heart. I love doing grief work, and this just captures it in such a wonderful, relatable, heartbreaking way. And again, along the way, each woman kind of discovers what they can relate to in the other women and their experiences of grief, even though they do process things very differently. Next up, we have an absolute classic, or at least I would call this a modern classic. This is one of the first books that I was ever exposed to that had really obvious, accurate mental health rep, and that is The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. And I read this in middle school, high school, late middle school, early high school, something like that. And just reading from a character's perspective who is, like the title says, a wallflower, who has social anxiety, who is kind of the quirky guy who doesn't fit in, which of course this book does suffer from a little bit of manic pixie dream girl syndrome, but nevertheless, I do think the representation is great, especially as we get deeper into the book and you start to realize the trauma and the underlying mental health things that are going on for Charlie. Also, this book, if you didn't already know, is written in letters. So Charlie's therapist has told him that he should write letters to a friend, and he doesn't really have any. So he just starts writing these letters, and we're the friend. We're receiving them and reading like, "Dear friend, this is what's going on." And we follow him as he gains his first ever friend group and navigates high school as, you know, triggering things are coming up for him. And I think this could be something really relatable, but also, again, very triggering. So with any of these, make sure you look up the trigger warnings before diving in. Now I have a true classic recommendation, and that is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. I know this one is very cliche. It's probably on every mental health representation in fiction list ever, but that is because it is so well done. Obviously, some of the terminology and treatment methods like electroconvulsive therapy would be really outdated from something that we'd see today, but the way that Sylvia Plath describes this main character really descending into madness and not being taken seriously, and especially because she's a woman, being discounted and invalidated for her feelings and for her mental health concerns. It is so real and so relatable to this day, even though I believe this came out in the 60s or 50s. So this is a very old book, but these feelings have been around for decades and they will continue to be around for decades. So even if the actual mental health methods and therapy rep isn't accurate to today, if you want to feel seen in your depression or psychosis or whatever it is you're dealing with, especially if you've experienced a lot of invalidation with your symptoms, I think this could be a great read for you. Next up, I want to take a little break and get into some YA recommendations. I know I don't usually read a lot of YA or recommend it, but I think there is a huge need for mental health rep in YA books. So here are my top 3 favorites. First, we have All the Bright Places by Jennifer Niven. This is a YA romance contemporary story about 2 main characters that are dealing with depression. And this book, while it is viscerally written and the mental health rep is very accurate, although, you know, everyone's experience of depression is different and varied, this one really resonated with me when I read it, I believe in high school, and it's heavy. Okay, guys, this is a heavy one. But again, if you've experienced depression and you want to feel seen, you want to experience that representation, or maybe you've never experienced depression, but you want to know how it feels for that friend or family member that's going through it, that you can't quite picture it, this would be a great one to pick up. Another YA author who I think her entire backlist is just absolutely wonderful is Elizabeth Acevedo. This is my favorite of hers. It's called The Poet X, and it follows a high schooler as she's kind of navigating cultural expectations, religious expectations, gender norms, sexuality. All of these big identity pieces are coming up for her, and she learns to navigate that through slam poetry. It is a wonderful read. It tackles a lot of really hard subjects, but it does it really well. And all of the, coping mechanisms, the adolescent issues, everything that's coming up in here is just so well done. And I think Elizabeth Acevedo does this with all of her books, especially Clap When You Land. That's another one of my favorites that deals with grief, trauma, sexuality, and With the Fire on High deals with teen pregnancy. So really poignant issues that are coming up for young adults, represented in young adult novels in a beautiful writing style. These are written in verse and they are just absolutely gorgeous. And again, so poignant. And the last YA rec I have for you is The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. This follows a boy throughout his entire life from infancy to college and early young adult years as he is dealing with, again, cultural expectations. He is a mixed person and he's trying to figure out what cultural influences are important to him, what he wants to take on. He's also figuring out that he is gay along the way and coping with that through art and the art of drag specifically, which I love reading about drag. So if you do too, this one is great. And the way that he talks about discovering these things and putting the pieces of his identity together are so beautiful. And again, just so well done. Also, I did want to mention when I'm talking about sexuality in the arena of mental health rep, I'm not insinuating that being a part of the LGBTQIA community has anything to do with a psychological disorder. Obviously, being gay is not a diagnosis and it never should have been. However, because the LGBTQIA community is a marginalized group, we do experience higher instances of mental illness and struggle because of the oppression that we face and how hard it is to live in a very hetero society when you are a queer person. So that is why I touch on the sexuality pieces married with mental health rep. And this one does it beautifully. And again, this is another one written in verse, so it is just absolutely gorgeous. I also have a couple romance recommendations. It is really hard, I think, in my opinion, to do a romance with mental health rep right. I think a lot of mental health rep in romance is really bad and really inaccurate, and these romance authors really need to start doing their due diligence and consulting with a therapist before they include mental health diagnoses and therapy rep in their books. But a couple that do this really well are, first we have Hook, Line, and Sinker by Tessa Bailey. This has some of the best mental health representation that I've seen in modern romance. We are following Fox, who is kind of having a struggle with his identity. He also has a lot of trauma and attachment wounds that get addressed in here. And he is falling in love with Hannah, who is kind of struggling with her work identity and asserting herself and going for what she wants and her goals. She's also a little bit socially anxious and kind of a little bit of a wallflower, so we get to see her come out of her shell and help Fox address his stuff too. And it is so cute, also so hot, and it doesn't help to have a little break from the heavy mental health rep with some very hot smut. The other romance that I think just does mental health rep masterfully is It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. I'm sure this is no surprise for you if you've been watching my channel for a while. This book is in the romance genre. It's sold that way, but I would not call this a romance. I would call this just a really visceral, genuine depiction of what romantic partner abuse can look like. And it really takes intergenerational trauma and puts it under the microscope so you can see, what is the cycle of abuse? How do our parents and grandparents pass on their trauma and their mental health concerns to us if it's unresolved for them? We follow Lily as she finds herself in an abusive relationship and reflecting on her past by reading her journals from when she was growing up and kind of tracking how she got here. She grew up in an abusive household and now she's ended up in the creation of one herself. So it is very, very sad. The end absolutely broke me, especially the author's note when you find out the kind of inspiration behind the story for Colleen Hoover. But if you think you can handle it, it is a wonderful read to understand intergenerational trauma and the cycle of abuse. Jumping back into thrillers, we have The House We Grew Up In by Lisa Jewell. Honestly, Lisa Jewell's entire backlist, I think she approaches mental health in a very accurate and genuine way. I always have such extreme empathy for her characters, no matter what they're going through or how horrible they may seem because of the things that they are struggling with or maybe coping with in not the best way, because she writes these very intricate, fucked up family dynamics in such a understanding way that you just can't help but be, number one, enthralled in the story and the mystery of it all, and number two, really firmly on your protagonist's side of the story, feeling all of these feelings for them. And of her entire backlist, this one is my favorite. It follows the story of this family, and the matriarch has just passed away. And so all of her children are meeting up at her house to clean it out and decide what to do with all of her stuff in the midst of her passing. But this is not so simple because the mother actually suffered from hoarding disorder. And that is a really stigmatized diagnosis that is not talked about a lot. I think the representation in here is wonderful. And we also follow all of the siblings and the dad who have their own host of issues and mental health struggles. So this one is real good. There's also a lot of drama, a lot of mystery, a lot of intrigue. So it's a super fast-paced read as well. Finally, I want to talk about Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. This is a historical fiction that follows a Chinese American family. So I believe the mother is from China and the father of the family is just a white guy from America, and their children are obviously mixed Chinese Americans, and they feel this immense pressure on them, and the middle daughter actually ends up being found dead in the lake by their house, and they're trying to parse through how this could possibly happen. Was she murdered? Did she kill herself? If so, what led up to it? There's a lot of talk of suicidality in here and a lot of just talk about pressure, family pressure, how intergenerational trauma can create that pressure. I think this book is just so wonderfully well done. It does move at a little bit of a slower pace, but I think it allows you to take in the really big, heavy subjects that are being talked about a little bit better. And Celeste Ng, if you've read Little Fires Everywhere, you know how she builds her characters in this very real way. And the talk about suicide in this book is so well done, especially for it taking place in, I believe, the 70s. Yeah, it takes place in 1970s Ohio. So not a lot of great mental health rep there, but again, these conversations are not just relevant to that time. These feelings happen today as they have for years and will continue to exist for all of eternity as long as there are humans on Earth. So this is always relevant. So those are all of my recs for mental health in fiction, but I did have a few mental health nonfiction related books that I wanted to recommend to you guys as well in case you're interested. Honestly, as a therapist, self-help books are the bane of my existence. I don't like them at all. Oftentimes they feel extremely surface level, and I really just don't think you should waste your money on them. Maybe you should go to therapy instead. Again, click the link to BetterHelp. But these are the self-help-ish kind of books that I would recommend. The first two are by my queen, Brené Brown. We have Daring Greatly and I Thought It Was Just Me, But It Isn't. These two dive into experiences of shame, insecurity, vulnerability, all of the things that go along with that, especially in the context of women and being a woman in this world, and how imposter syndrome can show up for you, how shame and the shame cycle can start to take over your life. Brené Brown, if you don't know, is a psychological researcher that graduated from the University of Texas at Austin, which is where I graduated as well. So I absolutely love her and I love the research that she does. I think it is so important, and she offers really practical mental health advice in here that is based on her own research. So this is scientific research. This is not some motivational bullshit. This is real stuff, y'all. And I really highly recommend it if you struggle with vulnerability, if you struggle with imposter syndrome, and this one especially if you struggle with perfectionism and feeling like you can never measure up or be enough. But both of them are so good. And the other book I actually read as assigned reading in my master's program, but I enjoyed it so much that I reread it and I recommend it to everybody who enjoys mental health nonfiction. And that is The Power of Different by Gail Saltz. And this tackles mental health diagnoses through a lens of positive psychology. So we're seeing how different mental health diagnoses can actually be gifts, seeing the upsides of it, seeing the creativity that comes along with depression, the conscientiousness that comes along with anxiety. And it is a really empowering read if you struggle with any of those things. It can also, again, just help you gain empathy and understanding for people who suffer from psychological disorders. They go into a lot of different pieces of it, and it was great for me to read, obviously as a clinician, but I think it could be great for y'all as well. So if it sounds like something you'd be interested in, you have this therapist giving it a thumbs up. Go ahead and add it to cart because I know you want to. All right, guys, that is going to be it for me today. Thank you so much for watching this video, and thank you again to BetterHelp for sponsoring. Again, don't forget to click that link down below and start your therapy journey today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and give it a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And hopefully I will see you here in my next video. Bye!